Hey everyone, this is Mr. Tanner, and for this set of notes, we're going to be looking at what happens when resources are overused and how that is corrected in ecosystems, and then what happens if that overuse of a resource is not corrected within an ecosystem. So we're going to look again at the effects, really, of when resources are overused. And to start with, the main reason that resources are overused is due to overpopulation. And an English economist, actually, so nothing to even do with life science, but just an economist, Thomas Malthus, is really famous for this observation that populations grow faster than their food supply can keep up with. So, this is the idea that population growth in any species tends to outrun the food supply available to that population. So, as a consequence to this, organisms that become overpopulated don't have enough resources to maintain that population. So, the natural result of this is usually starvation. When there's not enough food to feed every organism in that population, there's starvation. And we'll look at that within a food web coming up. So let's look at this example here in this pretty simple food web. And we're going to really focus on grass, rabbits, and foxes, but we'll pay attention to what would happen to other organisms as well. So let's say in this ecosystem, the most efficient grass eater is rabbits. So, given a limited amount of resources, rabbits are going to outcompete mice and grasshoppers in this scenario for eating grasses and grains. Um, so, what's going to naturally happen is the rabbit population will keep growing. So, this rabbit population will grow. And as that rabbit population grows, they're going to eat more and more of those grasses. And as a consequence, the grasshopper population, which also feeds on these grasses, will decrease. Their population will go down. That's going to have a negative impact then on owls, things that are eating mostly grasshoppers and mice, especially birds. So we would see these populations go down, these go down due to this population growth in rabbits. But another organism here should also expect to see population growth as a result of this, and that's foxes. Since the rabbits are increasing their population, there's more rabbits to eat, so the population in foxes is going to grow as well. So this is where that corrective measure comes in. Because as the rabbits grow, they're outpacing their food supply. This is what Thomas Malthus tells us. So these rabbits are eventually going to get to a population where there's no longer enough grasses or carrots to feed them, and rabbits will start to starve. So once this happens, the rabbit population will decrease. And that's made worse by the fact that there was this increase in fox population. So now there's actually more predators eating, right? There's more predators eating the rabbits, but there's not enough food for the rabbits. So that population decrease in rabbits shrinks pretty rapidly. And when that happens, the rabbit population gets really small, so the grasses can grow, right? The grasses will increase their population now. But once there's a decrease in rabbits, there's no longer enough food for the foxes either, so now the foxes start to starve and their population decreases. And hopefully you can start to see this pattern, because now we have a low population of rabbits, a low population of foxes eating the rabbits, but the grasses have recovered, so now the rabbits start to grow again, and then the foxes will start to grow. And what you end up is this growth pattern where, if we're kind of drawing population, right, the rabbits grow, they run out of food, they're overeaten, their population shrinks, the food recovers, the foxes starve, their population can grow again. So in healthy ecosystems, we see this cycle of population growth, population death. And it's all to do with this fact that they're going to eventually overuse their resources, and as a result of that, they're going to starve. And we really see this pattern, this growth and death pattern, really, especially in predator prey relationships. So we're going to look at, on the next slide here, a predator prey graph, a population graph of rabbits. And I think they're showing wolves, but you would see the same thing in foxes as well, and we'll help explain this just a little bit more. So here's a more in-depth look at that little tiny kind of wave graph I drew on the previous slide. In the blue line, we have our population density of rabbits. So this is how many rabbits there are in a given space within an ecosystem. And then this green line would be their predator. I think they've shown a coyote or a wolf here. On the previous slide, we were looking at foxes. It doesn't really matter. The timeline would be different for different predators, but the effect is still the same. So what we're seeing here at the beginning is both the rabbits and the predator have relatively low population density, and that rabbit recovers a lot quicker. So they have low numbers. The grasses that they eat are going to be recovering, and they're able to build up their population density. And you can see on this timeline, if we try and draw a straight line here, that it's really not until after the population density is increasing, right? So if we can go a little bit from here and see that as that population starts increasing in rabbits, as a result, the predator population begins to increase as well. And then two things begin to happen simultaneously. One, the rabbits have overpopulated. They've outrun their food supply, so they begin to starve. So this is our starvation peak, where there's no longer enough food in the ecosystem, and it's also beginning to be impacted by the high population density of the predators. And as a result of those two things, their population plummets. So the rabbit population begins to go down, and when the rabbit population goes down, there's no longer enough food for these predators. They've done the same thing. They've overpopulated their food supply, so then they reach their starvation point. And then that cycle will continue. Their population decreases, the rabbits begin to recover, the predator's population recovers, the rabbits die off, the prey dies off, the predator dies off, and this pattern repeats. So this is what happens in a healthy ecosystem, this predator-prey pattern. But it would be true for grasses and rabbits too, right? We would see the grass abundance go up when the rabbit population is low, and then the grass population would die off as the rabbit population increases. So even with producers like plants and herbivores, we would see a similar pattern of overpopulation, starvation, overpopulation, starvation, and this repeats. This is a healthy ecosystem. So this idea that I was describing is what's called a negative feedback loop. And maybe the best way to describe this is with a thermostat in a house. Because if you have your thermostat that says, I want my house to be 72 degrees, if your house gets too hot, that kicks a negative feedback loop. The air conditioning turns on and it brings the house back down. And then if the house gets too cold, the heater might turn on and it would bring the house temperature back up, and it again self-corrects. This is the idea of a negative feedback loop, where if this is our set point, this horizontal line is whatever the set point is, when we go above that point, it gets brought back down. When we go below that point, it goes back up. And that's really what we see in population graphs. There's probably an ideal population size, And everything tends to self-correct towards that. When you go too high, the population starves. When you go too low, there's room to grow again and the population grows. But they don't just hover at a set point, they go above and below this negative feedback loop. So on their own, ecosystems, let's see, ecosystems tend to be self-corrective. When populations grow too large, they end up with a large loss of life, usually due to starvation, although when population density increases, disease increases as well, and their population shrinks. When populations get too small, there is now more resources, more food, more space, more shelter for the remaining organisms, and that population tends to grow again. But what happens when that feedback loop is broken? So what if the grasses that the rabbits are eating don't just decrease in their population size? What if they go extinct? What if a disease or an insect that kills grasses completely wipes out the grasses and now there's no more food for the rabbits? Well, this leads to extinction. So when this feedback loop is broken, we get extinctions. And extinctions are not rare. Extinctions happen all the time. Every day, things go extinct. Scientists estimate that of all the species that have ever lived on Earth, 99.9% of them have gone extinct. So, this kind of normal, everyday extinction is what we call background extinctions. They just happen in the background. So background extinctions occur naturally all the time, and they can have many causes, including disease, right? Disease can wipe out a resource that leads to extinction. Overpredation. If the fox population gets so large that they can eat all of the rabbits, then the rabbits have gone extinct. So overpredation can. Loss of any of the resources, right? We talked in Green Circle about those basic needs for organisms, and if any of those are truly lost, not just limited, but lost, then that organism is likely to go extinct. The other much more rare type of extinction is a mass extinction. And mass extinctions occur from catastrophic environmental changes or natural disasters. I think the mass extinction that everyone tends to know about is the death of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago from that meteor that impacted near the Gulf of Mexico in Chicxulub. So we kind of all tend to know about that one, but that's actually one of the smallest of the 5 mass extinctions that have ever happened. But for a mass extinction to occur, 50% of all living species will go extinct in a relatively short period of time. And when we say relatively short period of time, we're talking about geologic time. We're talking about in the history of the Earth, which is 4.5 billion years old. So in this instance, thousands of years is relatively short. So it's not always just a meteor impacts and then boom, life is gone. It can be from slower processes. And several scientists would argue that we are currently in a mass extinction because life is dying out much faster than we would expect for just normal background extinction. So again, fast is relative here. It's not fast for a human lifespan, but it's fast in terms of the age of the Earth. And then finally, when we're looking at reasons the negative feedback loop that exists within ecosystems, where when populations grow, organisms starve and the population shrinks, and then they have increased resources and their population grows. That feedback loop we've been talking about, one of the biggest reasons that feedback loop breaks is human activity. So I've called this kind of the human anomaly, because an anomaly is something that does not follow the normal or expected pattern of behavior. What we've been talking about is that population growth that really should look like this in an ecosystem of growth, loss of life, growth, loss of life again. But when we look at the human population curve it is anomalous. It is not following that same pattern. So let's take a look at it. Here is that human population growth curve. And you can see for thousands and thousands of years, we start at 10,000 years BCE, that's 12,000 years ago. For thousands and thousands of years, the population is growing really, really slowly. And then in the 1400s, when we get really good at agriculture and growing extra food, the population skyrockets to the point where now it is nearly 8 billion people living on Earth. But this is not the pattern that we see in other species. This is why it's anomalous. This is not what Thomas Malthus would have predicted for humans. Thomas Malthus would say, well, we've become overpopulated, so there should be mass starvation and the population should be decreasing. But it's not. And there's a few reasons why. The main one is technology. And not just in the sense of computers, but agriculture. We are getting really, really good at farming and growing huge amounts of food and growing more food in less space than we ever thought possible. And this is due to things like fertilizers, pesticides, preventing insects from eating our foods before we can harvest them. And more recently, genetically modifying our foods to grow better or grow in new places. Without these technologies, there's no way to support 8 billion people. If we passed laws that said the only food we're allowed to give now is organic food, billions of humans would starve to death, because it is these technologies that have allowed us to be anomalous in our growth curve. We can keep making more food because our technology keeps getting better for how we grow food. Another big reason for this is transportation. If our ecosystem that we live in cannot produce enough food, we can send food from a different ecosystem. I can get food from around the world just by going to my grocery store because our transportation is so good. And then the last thing is our ability to just overtake and change ecosystems. Forests are not good for growing crops. Humans can cut down that forest and turn it into an area that can grow crops. So humans have the ability to just make more farmland, which is not something any other organism can do. But all of these things that we're doing to feed our massive population have impacts on the rest of our ecosystem. And this is certainly not a comprehensive list. There's many other things that are impacted by our population growth, but we see increased habitat loss, increased in background extinction rates, which is why some scientists say maybe we're in the 6th mass extinction right now. We have overhunting, we have overfishing, we have increased natural disasters, especially forest fires due to human activity. I think most forest fires now are caused by humans, not natural events like lightning. And then a big one that we'll come back to more in Black Diamond is increased carbon emissions due to our factories and burning of fossil fuels in general. So these are all negative impacts that humans have, not because humans are just evil and want to destroy populations and want to kill other animals, but because we have way outgrown our population growth curve, and our brains have allowed us to come up with ways to keep that large number of humans alive. And I think it's really tempting to just say, well, we need to just fix this. But right now, there's not really a way to fix this without causing billions of human deaths. So if this was a simple solution, we would have found it by now. It's a very complex moral and ethical problem that has come from the fact that the human growth curve is anomalous. It does not follow the pattern that we normally see in nature. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, always reach out. But see you next time.